The neon lights flickered against the March night sky as Brian Shaffer stepped out of his father's car, the weight of weeks pressing down on his 27-year-old shoulders like a stone. Columbus, Ohio, stretched out before him in all its familiar college town glory, the mix of brick buildings and modern facades that defined the Ohio State University campus area, the distant hum of traffic on High Street, the sound of laughter drifting from open doors of bars and restaurants. It was March 31st, 2006, the last day before spring break, and Brian had every reason to celebrate. His second year of medical school was nearly behind him. His girlfriend Alexis was waiting for him in Toledo, and in just 3 days they would be on a plane to Miami for a much-needed vacation. But celebration felt hollow tonight. His mother's absence hung in the air like incense from a funeral he was still trying to forget, her battle with cancer having ended just 2 months earlier. The loss had carved something irreplaceable from the fabric of their family, leaving Brian and his father, Randy, to navigate grief while trying to maintain the rhythms of ordinary life. Brian buried himself in medical textbooks, memorizing symptoms and treatments with the desperate intensity of someone trying to outrun sorrow. Randy watched his son with worried eyes, recognizing the exhaustion that came from studying through too many nights, from carrying too much weight alone. "You look tired, son," Randy had said over their steak dinner earlier that evening, noting the dark circles under Brian's hazel eyes, the way his 6'2" frame seemed to fold in on itself when he thought no one was looking. "Maybe you should stay in tonight, get some rest before your trip." But Brian had already made plans with his friend Clint Florence, and Randy didn't press the issue. Sometimes a young man needed to be with friends, needed to laugh and forget, even if just for one night. If you're watching this story unfold, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These disappearances touch communities across America, and your engagement helps us continue sharing these important stories. The Ugly Tuna Saloona occupied the second floor of the South Campus Gateway building, a relatively new complex that had risen from the ashes of a grittier, more dangerous version of this neighborhood. The Gateway represented Columbus's attempt to gentrify the area around campus, to create a safe haven of shops, restaurants, and entertainment venues where students could gather without fear. Security cameras watched from corners and doorways, silent sentries that business owners hoped would deter the kind of crime that had plagued this stretch of High Street for years. Brian met Clint Florence at 9 p.m., their friendship built on shared classes and the easy camaraderie of two young men navigating the pressures of higher education. Florence was shorter than Brian, more compact, with the kind of easy smile that made him popular in social settings. They ordered drinks at the Ugly Tuna, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a college bar on the last night before spring break, students celebrating freedom, couples making weekend plans, the kind of controlled revelry that marked transitions in the academic calendar. At 10 p.m., Brian stepped away to call Alexis in Toledo, his voice carrying the warmth that always crept in when he spoke to her. She was visiting family before their Miami trip, probably packing sundresses and beach novels, counting down the hours until they could leave Ohio's gray March behind for Florida sunshine. Their relationship had deepened over the past year, built on shared ambitions and the quiet understanding between two people who had found something worth protecting. Brian had been carrying an engagement ring in his thoughts, if not yet in his pocket, the kind of future planning that made the present moment feel both precious and temporary. "I can't wait to see you," he told her over the phone, his words mixing with the background noise of conversation and clinking glasses. "Just a few more days, and we'll be drinking something tropical instead of beer." The normalcy of the conversation would later feel heartbreaking to those who remembered it. Two people in love, making plans they would never keep, promises the future would not honor. After the call, Brian and Florence embarked on what would later be reconstructed as a methodical tour of Columbus's drinking establishments. They moved from bar to bar like tourists in their own city, working their way down High Street toward the Arena District, each stop marked by a single shot of hard liquor. The night unfolded with the predictable rhythm of young men, with too much stress and too much freedom, the gradual loosening of inhibitions, the easy laughter that comes with alcohol and friendship, the sensation of being exactly where they belonged in that moment. The Arena District pulsed with its own energy, the newer bars and restaurants drawing crowds away from the traditional college hangouts. Here, young professionals mixed with students, creating a different kind of atmosphere, sleeker, more expensive, but also somehow more anonymous. Brian and Florence moved through these spaces like they owned them, two attractive young men with money to spend and time to kill, unaware that every choice they made was being logged in the memory of a night that would soon become evidence. It was after midnight when they encountered Meredith Reed in the short north, that strip of High Street known for its galleries, boutiques, and upscale dining. Reed was a friend of Florence's, the kind of connection that made Columbus feel like the small city it really was, beneath its university town facade. She offered them a ride back to where they had started, the Ugly Tuna Saloona, and joined them for what they planned as one final round before calling it a night. The Ugly Tuna, at closing time, carried a different energy than it had earlier in the evening. The crowd was thinner now, composed of the dedicated partiers and those unwilling to let go of Friday night. The band was finishing their set, their equipment creating obstacles on the small stage, their music providing a soundtrack to conversations that grew louder as the alcohol took hold. Brian moved through this familiar landscape with the confidence of someone who had spent countless nights in places just like this, someone who understood the unwritten rules of college social life. Somewhere in the complexity of that final hour, Brian Shaffer separated from his companions. The exact moment of separation would become one of the most scrutinized details in what followed, analyzed and reanalyzed by investigators trying to understand how a night of celebration became the beginning of a mystery. Florence and Reed later described looking for him, calling his name in the crowded bar, checking the bathroom, asking bartenders if they had seen their tall friend with the brown hair and Pearl Jam tattoo on his upper arm. At 1:55 a.m., security cameras captured Brian outside the Ugly Tuna Saloona, engaged in conversation with two young women. The footage showed him, as he had been all evening, relaxed, social, apparently untroubled by whatever had caused him to step away from his friends. He wore an olive-green polo shirt layered over a long-sleeved white shirt, blue jeans, and white Adidas tennis shoes, the uniform of a college student on a night out. His body language suggested someone wrapping up a pleasant conversation, someone preparing to rejoin friends or head home to sleep off the evening's indulgences. The women would later be identified and interviewed, their conversation with Brian revealed as nothing more than the casual social interaction that happened thousands of times every weekend in college towns across America. They were strangers to him, fellow students celebrating the start of spring break, their brief encounter notable only because it was captured on camera, because it became the last confirmed sighting of Brian Shaffer as a free man moving through the world under his own power. What happened next would transform an ordinary Friday night into something else entirely. The security camera recorded Brian saying goodbye to the women, then walking toward the entrance of the Ugly Tuna Saloona. He moved with purpose, perhaps intending to find Florence and Reed, perhaps planning to speak with the band, as he had mentioned earlier. The camera angle captured his approach to the entrance, then lost him as he moved beyond its field of view. He was never seen leaving the establishment. Florence and Reed waited outside as the bar emptied at 2 a.m., scanning faces in the crowd of departing patrons, expecting to spot Brian's familiar tall frame among those spilling out onto High Street. The Ugly Tuna closed with the systematic efficiency of a business operation. Lights coming up, music stopping, staff beginning the nightly ritual of cleaning and counting. But Brian was not among those who left through the main entrance, not visible to his friends or to the security cameras that watched the exits. When Brian failed to appear, Florence and Reed made the assumption that seemed most logical in that moment, that he had somehow left without them noticing, that he had caught a ride with someone else or decided to walk back to his nearby apartment. College students were notorious for making impulsive decisions, for changing plans without notice. In a night of drinking and socializing, it was easy to lose track of friends, easy to assume that everyone had made their own arrangements for getting home safely. But Brian Shaffer had not gone home. His apartment remained exactly as he had left it earlier that evening, bed made, medical books stacked neatly on shelves, car parked in its designated space. The ordinariness of the scene would later strike investigators as particularly unsettling, the way his life seemed frozen in the moment before he left for dinner with his father, as if he had simply stepped out for a few hours and planned to return to resume his routine. Saturday passed without contact. Alexis called Brian's phone multiple times, each call going straight to voicemail, each unanswered ring building anxiety that she initially tried to dismiss as overcaution. College students slept off hangovers, forgot to charge phones, made impulsive decisions about how to spend their weekends. But as Saturday stretched into Sunday without word, without the text messages or calls that normally punctuated their days, Alexis felt the first cold touch of genuine fear. Randy Shaffer experienced his own version of growing alarm as the weekend progressed without hearing from his son. Their dinner conversation from Friday night replayed in his memory. Brian's exhaustion, his determination to go out despite being tired, the weight of loss they both carried but rarely discussed directly. Randy knew his son well enough to recognize that Brian was struggling with more than just medical school pressure, that his mother's death had affected him in ways that he kept private, buried beneath his drive to succeed and his commitment to his future with Alexis. Sunday evening brought Alexis to Brian's apartment, her key fitting the lock with the smooth familiarity of someone who belonged in that space. The apartment felt hollow without him, too quiet, too neat. His textbooks lay open to the pages he had been studying. His clothes were folded in drawers. His toothbrush sat in its usual place by the bathroom sink. Everything suggested a temporary absence, someone who had stepped out and would return at any moment to resume his life exactly where he had left it. Derek Shaffer arrived at his brother's apartment that evening, sent by their father, who was beginning to acknowledge that Brian's silence was not normal, not explained by a hangover or a spontaneous weekend trip. Derek found Alexis waiting in the parking lot, her worry now undeniable, her normal composure cracked by hours of unanswered calls and growing certainty that something was wrong. The two of them entered the apartment together, searching for clues that might explain Brian's absence, hoping to find evidence of plans he had made without telling anyone. But the apartment revealed nothing unusual, nothing disturbed or out of place. Brian's suitcase sat packed for Miami, his passport ready for travel, his life organized around the assumption that Monday morning would bring a flight to Florida and a week of beaches and sunshine. The normalcy felt ominous now. The gap between Brian's careful preparations for his vacation and his sudden absence too stark to explain with ordinary circumstances. Monday morning brought the deadline that transformed worry into crisis. Brian's failure to appear for his flight to Miami marked the moment when his disappearance became official, when the possibility of misunderstanding gave way to the certainty that something had happened to prevent him from keeping his commitments. His phone continued to go straight to voicemail, his apartment remained empty, his car stayed parked in the same space where he had left it Friday evening. Randy Shaffer made the call to Columbus Police that Monday, his voice steady as he provided the basic information that would launch an investigation: his son's name, age, physical description, the last known time and place anyone had seen him alive. The officer who took the report heard details that were both routine and troubling. A responsible young man who had disappeared without explanation, leaving behind his car, his belongings, his carefully planned life, vanishing somewhere between the security camera footage at 1:55 a.m. and the moment when he should have walked out of the Ugly Tuna Saloona with everyone else. The Columbus Police Department approached Brian's disappearance with the systematic thoroughness that marked their handling of missing persons cases. Detective Andre Edwards took point on the investigation, his experience with similar cases providing a framework for understanding what they might be dealing with. Young men disappeared for various reasons, some voluntary, some not, and the first 48 hours were crucial for determining which category Brian's case might fall into. The Ugly Tuna Saloona became the natural starting point for the investigation, the last place Brian had been definitively seen, the location where his trail went cold. The bar occupied the second floor of the South Campus Gateway complex, accessible by escalator from the ground floor, with limited points of entry and exit that should have made it relatively simple to track the movement of patrons. Security cameras covered the main entrance and several other areas, creating what appeared to be comprehensive surveillance of the space. Detective Edwards and his team began by reviewing all available security footage from the night of March 31st and early morning hours of April 1st. The cameras had captured Brian's arrival at the Ugly Tuna with Florence and Reed, their movements within the limited field of view, and most importantly, Brian's final recorded appearance outside the establishment at 1:55 a.m. But the cameras had not captured him leaving, despite recording the exodus of other patrons when the bar closed at 2 a.m. This absence of departure footage presented investigators with their first significant puzzle. The Ugly Tuna Saloona had limited exits: the main entrance where security cameras maintained surveillance, and a service entrance that led to a construction area on the first floor of the building. The service entrance was not intended for public use and was located near where Brian had last been seen on camera. However, accessing this exit would have required navigation through a construction zone that would have been difficult for anyone, especially someone who had been drinking for several hours. The construction area itself became a focus of intense investigation. Police brought in cadaver dogs to search for any trace of Brian, any indication that he might have attempted to leave through the service entrance and encountered some kind of accident or foul play. The dogs showed interest in certain areas, but did not provide definitive alerts that would indicate the presence of human remains. The construction zone was thoroughly searched, every piece of debris examined, every possible hiding place investigated. Physical evidence proved frustratingly sparse. Brian's cell phone had gone dead or been turned off sometime after 1:55 a.m., making it impossible to track his movements through cell tower pings. His credit cards showed no activity after his purchases at various bars earlier in the evening. His bank account remained untouched. Every digital footprint that might have provided clues about his whereabouts simply stopped at the moment when he walked off camera at the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Interviews began with everyone who had been in contact with Brian during his final evening. Florence and Reed provided detailed accounts of their bar-hopping expedition, their recollections of Brian's behavior and mood, their last memories of seeing him at the Ugly Tuna. Both described him as appearing normal for someone who had been drinking, social, relaxed, not displaying signs of distress or unusual behavior that might have foreshadowed his disappearance. The two women who had spoken with Brian outside the Ugly Tuna were located and interviewed. Their conversation with him had been brief and unremarkable, the kind of casual social interaction that happened at bars every night. They described Brian as friendly and apparently sober enough to hold a coherent conversation, showing no signs of distress or indication that he was planning to leave or meet someone. Their testimony reinforced the impression of Brian as someone who was simply ending a normal evening out, making his subsequent disappearance even more perplexing. Bar staff, security personnel, and members of the band that had been playing at the Ugly Tuna were all interviewed extensively. No one remembered seeing Brian after the time frame captured on security cameras. No one recalled him mentioning plans to leave with anyone or go anywhere specific. The band members, whom Brian had supposedly intended to speak with according to his friends, had no memory of any interaction with him during their final set or afterward. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate scene to include searches of areas where Brian might have gone or been taken. Police and volunteers scoured the banks of the Olentangy River, which ran through Columbus, not far from the campus area. They checked construction sites, abandoned buildings, and any location where someone might have ended up voluntarily or involuntarily. Hospitals, homeless shelters, and morgues in Columbus and surrounding areas were contacted, but none had any record of anyone matching Brian's description. As days turned to weeks without any significant leads, the investigation began to consider less conventional theories. The case attracted attention from online amateur investigators who proposed everything from voluntary disappearance to involvement with organized crime to connection with unrelated serial killer cases. One theory that gained particular attention was the possibility that Brian had fallen victim to the so-called smiley face killer, a theoretical serial killer allegedly targeting college-aged men in the Midwest, though law enforcement agencies generally dismissed this theory as lacking credible evidence. Detective Edwards found himself dealing with a case that defied easy categorization. Brian had no history of mental health issues that might suggest suicide, no financial problems that might motivate voluntary disappearance, no enemies or conflicts that might point to foul play. His relationship with Alexis was stable and happy. His family relationships were strong. Despite the recent loss of his mother, his academic career was progressing successfully. Every aspect of his life suggested someone with reasons to stay, not someone planning to vanish. The security camera footage became the subject of intense analysis by investigators and independent experts. Every frame was examined for clues that might have been missed, every angle studied to understand exactly what areas remained outside camera coverage. The timing of Brian's movements was calculated and recalculated, compared with the movements of other patrons to understand the normal flow of people entering and leaving the establishment. One particularly puzzling aspect of the footage was the completeness with which Brian seemed to vanish. While the cameras had not captured every angle of the Ugly Tuna and surrounding areas, they had recorded the departures of other patrons throughout the evening, and especially during the closing time exodus. Brian's complete absence from any departure footage suggested either that he had left through an unmonitored route or that he had never left the building at all. This possibility led to extensive searches of the Ugly Tuna Saloona itself and the entire South Campus Gateway complex. Every room, storage area, utility space, and potential hiding place was examined. The building's construction and layout were studied to understand every possible route someone might take, every space where someone might end up intentionally or accidentally. Architectural plans were consulted, building management was interviewed, and every person with access to restricted areas was questioned. The search efforts expanded to include areas beyond the immediate vicinity of the bar. Columbus police coordinated with volunteer groups to conduct systematic searches of parks, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and any location where someone might have gone voluntarily or been taken against their will. The searches were methodical and comprehensive, involving hundreds of people over many weekends, but they produced no evidence of Brian's whereabouts or fate. 6 months after Brian's disappearance, Alexis Wagoner believed she might have found the breakthrough everyone had been hoping for. She was working at a restaurant in Toledo when a customer entered, whom she was certain was Brian. The man had the same height, build, and general appearance, and Alexis was convinced enough to approach him. However, when she got closer, she realized her mistake. The physical resemblance had been coincidental, her desperate hope playing tricks on her eyes in the dim restaurant lighting. The false sighting highlighted the psychological toll that Brian's disappearance had taken on those who loved him. Alexis had thrown herself into the search efforts, creating and distributing missing person flyers, organizing volunteer search parties, maintaining a constant presence in media coverage of the case. But the months of uncertainty, of false leads and dead ends, were wearing down her resilience and that of Brian's family. Randy Shaffer faced his own version of this exhaustion, having lost his wife to cancer and now dealing with his son's unexplained absence. The double tragedy had transformed his life completely, replacing the routine of work and family with the endless uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to Brian. He participated in press conferences, worked with investigators, and maintained hope publicly while privately struggling with scenarios too dark to voice. The case began attracting national media attention, partly because of its puzzling circumstances, and partly because Brian fit the profile of victims who generated public sympathy: young, attractive, successful, with a bright future that had been interrupted without explanation. Television programs featured Brian's story, online forums dissected every detail of the investigation, and amateur sleuths proposed theories ranging from plausible to bizarre. This media attention brought both benefits and complications to the investigation. Tips poured in from across the country, each one requiring follow-up, despite the low probability of any single tip providing the breakthrough investigators needed. Some tips were well-intentioned, but based on misidentification or wishful thinking. Others were deliberate hoaxes from people seeking attention or trying to mislead the investigation. Sorting through these tips consumed enormous amounts of investigative resources while rarely producing useful information. Detective Edwards and his team continued pursuing leads methodically, following up on every credible tip, re-interviewing witnesses when new questions arose, and maintaining pressure on anyone who might have information about Brian's disappearance. The investigation remained active, but as months turned to years, the realistic hope of finding Brian alive began to fade, while the mystery of what happened to him only deepened. The lack of resolution began affecting everyone connected to the case in different ways. Florence, who had been with Brian during his final evening, found himself under increased scrutiny from both investigators and online amateur detectives. Some theories suggested that he knew more about Brian's disappearance than he had revealed, though he consistently maintained that he had told investigators everything he remembered about that night. The suspicion and speculation took a toll on Florence's own life, affecting his relationships and his ability to move forward from the trauma of losing his friend. Reed, the friend who had given Brian and Florence a ride back to the Ugly Tuna, experienced similar scrutiny, but to a lesser degree. Her role in the evening's events was more peripheral, making her a less likely target for theories about hidden knowledge or involvement. However, she still faced questioning about every detail of her interactions with Brian, every nuance of his behavior that might provide clues about his state of mind or intentions. The investigation's focus on Brian's final hours sometimes obscured the larger picture of who he had been and what his disappearance meant to the people who knew him best. Brian had been more than just a medical student out for a night of drinking. He had been a son, dealing with grief, a boyfriend planning a future, a young man trying to balance the pressures of professional ambition with the human need for connection and joy. His disappearance represented not just the loss of one person, but the destruction of all the relationships and plans that had revolved around his presence in the world. The Pearl Jam tattoo on Brian's upper right arm became one of the most recognizable details in missing person flyers and media coverage. The tattoo was distinctive enough to help with identification, but it also represented something deeper about Brian's personality, his connection to music, his willingness to make permanent choices about things he loved, his identification with a band known for their authenticity and emotional intensity. The tattoo made Brian more than just a collection of physical statistics. It made him a person with tastes and preferences, someone who had made choices about how to express his identity. As the investigation continued, patterns began to emerge in how people remembered Brian's final evening. Multiple witnesses described him as seeming normal, relaxed, engaged in typical social behavior for someone his age in that environment. No one recalled him appearing distressed, frightened, angry, or otherwise displaying behavior that might suggest he was planning to disappear or that he was in immediate danger. This consistent portrait of normalcy made his disappearance even more mysterious, eliminating many of the usual explanations for why someone might vanish. The question of whether Brian had left the Ugly Tuna Saloona voluntarily or involuntarily became central to understanding what might have happened to him. If he had left voluntarily, it suggested either a planned disappearance or an impulsive decision to go somewhere with someone he had met that night. If he had left involuntarily, it pointed toward abduction or some kind of accident. But the security camera evidence made either scenario difficult to explain. How could someone leave a building without being recorded by any of the surveillance systems in place? Years passed without resolution, and Brian's case joined the ranks of famous unsolved disappearances that capture public imagination precisely because they seem inexplicable. His story was featured in documentaries, podcasts, and television programs dedicated to missing persons cases. Each new telling of his story brought fresh attention to the investigation and sometimes generated new tips. But none of these leads brought investigators closer to understanding what had happened to him. The passage of time created new challenges for the investigation. Witnesses' memories became less reliable, physical evidence degraded or was lost, and the original investigators retired or moved to other assignments. Cold case units took over responsibility for Brian's case, applying fresh eyes and new techniques to the existing evidence, but they faced the same fundamental problem that had stymied the original investigation: a complete absence of concrete leads about where Brian had gone or what had happened to him after he walked off camera at the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Technological advances offered some hope for new breakthroughs in the case. Improved surveillance analysis techniques allowed investigators to examine the original footage with greater precision, looking for details that might have been missed in earlier reviews. Enhanced communication tracking methods provided better tools for analyzing cell phone records and other digital evidence, though Brian's phone had gone dead too quickly to provide much useful information. DNA analysis capabilities improved significantly over the years since Brian's disappearance, offering the possibility of identifying biological evidence that might have been overlooked or considered inconclusive using earlier testing methods. However, the lack of physical evidence from the scene meant that these technological advances had limited application to Brian's specific case. Without a crime scene or confirmed evidence of foul play, there was little material for advanced forensic analysis to examine. The anniversary of Brian's disappearance became an annual reminder of the case's unsolved status. Each April 1st brought renewed media coverage, fresh appeals for information from the public, and statements from investigators that the case remained active and that they continued to hope for a breakthrough. These anniversary stories served to keep Brian's disappearance in public consciousness, ensuring that his case would not be forgotten even as years passed without resolution. For Alexis Wagoner, these anniversaries represented particularly difficult emotional milestones. Each year that passed without answers made it harder to maintain hope, while also making it more difficult to fully accept loss and move forward. The uncertainty created a kind of emotional limbo, where grief could not be properly processed because the loss could not be confirmed. This ambiguous loss affected not just Alexis, but Brian's entire family and friend network, all of whom struggled with not knowing whether to hope or to mourn. Randy Shaffer's public statements over the years revealed a father's determination to find answers mixed with growing acceptance that those answers might never come. He continued participating in media interviews and working with investigators, but his comments increasingly focused on keeping Brian's memory alive rather than on immediate hopes of finding him. The transformation in Randy's public statements reflected the psychological journey that families of missing persons often experience. From urgent hope to persistent determination to eventual acceptance of uncertainty. The theories about Brian's disappearance evolved over time as investigators and amateur sleuths continued analyzing the available evidence. Some focused on the possibility that he had voluntarily disappeared, perhaps overwhelmed by grief over his mother's death and pressure from medical school. Others insisted that foul play was involved, though they struggled to explain how someone could have been abducted from a crowded bar without leaving any trace or being captured on security cameras. One theory that gained periodic attention was the idea that Brian had somehow hidden in the Ugly Tuna Saloona after closing time, either intentionally or accidentally, and that something had happened to him within the building itself. This theory led to repeated searches of the premises over the years, including examination of areas that were not easily accessible to the general public. However, these searches never produced evidence supporting this possibility, and building management consistently denied that there were areas where someone could remain hidden for extended periods. The construction area near the service exit continued to attract investigative attention years after Brian's initial disappearance. As construction projects in that area of the building were completed and new ones began, investigators examined each phase of work for any evidence that might relate to Brian's case. The possibility that he had encountered some kind of accident in the construction zone remained viable, but searches and analysis of the area never produced conclusive evidence to support this theory. Online communities dedicated to discussing Brian's case developed their own theories and conducted their own research, sometimes generating insights that official investigators found useful. These amateur detectives pored over security camera footage frame by frame, analyzed witness statements for inconsistencies, and proposed scenarios that official investigators might not have considered. While most of these theories proved unfounded, the online attention helped ensure that Brian's case remained in public consciousness and occasionally generated tips that warranted investigation. The question of whether Brian had been intoxicated enough for his judgment to be significantly impaired became important for understanding his likely behavior during his final hours. Witness accounts and bar receipts suggested that he had consumed alcohol throughout the evening, but had not appeared heavily intoxicated to those who interacted with him. This assessment suggested that he would have been capable of making rational decisions about where to go and what to do, making his disappearance more puzzling than if he had been severely impaired and prone to poor judgment. Florence's account of the evening's events came under repeated scrutiny over the years, with some observers suggesting that he had not been completely forthcoming about what had happened. Florence consistently maintained that he had told investigators everything he remembered about the night, but his decision not to take a polygraph test when initially offered led to ongoing speculation about whether he knew more than he had revealed. This speculation was never supported by concrete evidence, but it contributed to theories about possible involvement or concealment of information by people who had been with Brian during his final hours. The psychological profile that investigators developed of Brian suggested someone who was unlikely to disappear voluntarily without leaving some kind of message or indication of his intentions. He was described as responsible, family-oriented, and committed to his relationship with Alexis and his medical career. While he was dealing with grief over his mother's death, he had not displayed signs of severe depression or suicidal ideation that might explain a decision to disappear. His packed suitcase and confirmed travel plans suggested someone looking forward to immediate future events, not someone planning to abandon his life. Alternative theories about Brian's disappearance sometimes focused on the possibility that he had been the victim of a random crime that occurred after he left the Ugly Tuna Saloona through an unmonitored exit. Columbus had experienced various types of violent crime during that period, and the area around campus was not immune to robbery, assault, or other criminal activity. However, the absence of any evidence of struggle, any witnesses to criminal activity, or any demands for ransom made this theory difficult to support with concrete evidence. The timing of Brian's disappearance, occurring just before spring break when many students were leaving town for vacation, initially complicated the investigation by reducing the number of potential witnesses who were available for immediate questioning. Some students had already left Columbus for spring break destinations, while others left during the days immediately following Brian's disappearance. This timing meant that some people who might have seen Brian or noticed unusual activity in the area were not available to investigators until they returned from their vacations, by which time their memories had faded and their observations seemed less relevant. 15 years after Brian's disappearance, the case remains officially open and unsolved. Columbus police continue to maintain that they would pursue any credible leads that might emerge, but active investigation has necessarily decreased as other cases have demanded attention and resources. The case file remains available for review by new investigators who might bring fresh perspectives or new techniques to the analysis of existing evidence. The South Campus Gateway building, where the Ugly Tuna Saloona was located, has undergone changes over the years since Brian's disappearance, with businesses opening and closing, renovations altering the physical layout, and new security systems replacing the cameras that captured Brian's final known movements. These changes have made it more difficult to recreate the exact conditions that existed on the night Brian disappeared, though investigators maintain copies of the original building plans and security footage that documented the scene as it was in 2006. Brian Shaffer would be 46 years old now, a fact that investigators acknowledge when considering the possibility that he might still be alive somewhere. Age progression photographs have been created to show what he might look like after 20 years, accounting for normal aging and possible changes in appearance. These images are periodically circulated in media coverage of the case and posted on missing persons websites, maintaining the possibility that someone might recognize an older version of Brian living under a different identity somewhere else. The medical degree that Brian was pursuing when he disappeared represents one of the most poignant aspects of his case: the lost potential of someone who was preparing to dedicate his life to helping others. His classmates graduated and went on to practice medicine, save lives, and build careers in healthcare, while Brian's potential contributions to the field were lost, along with his physical presence. This aspect of his disappearance adds another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking case, representing not just personal loss, but societal loss of someone who might have made significant contributions to his community and profession. For those who knew Brian personally, the passage of 20 years has brought a complex mixture of acceptance and continued hope. Some have moved forward with their lives while maintaining private hopes that answers might still emerge. Others have reached a point of acceptance that they may never know what happened to Brian, choosing to remember him as he was rather than continuing to focus on the circumstances of his disappearance. These different approaches to coping with unresolved loss reflect the various ways people process ambiguous grief when death cannot be confirmed, but hope becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The security camera footage that captured Brian's final known movements remains one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in modern missing persons cases. The images have been enhanced, slowed down, examined from every possible angle, and compared with footage of other patrons to understand normal movement patterns in and around the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Despite this intensive analysis, the footage has never revealed additional clues about where Brian went or what happened to him after he walked off camera for the final time. In the end, Brian Shaffer's disappearance stands as one of the most perplexing missing persons cases in recent American history, a mystery that has resisted solution despite extensive investigation, significant media attention, and the application of advancing forensic technologies. His case demonstrates how someone can seemingly vanish without a trace, even in an environment with security cameras, multiple witnesses, and immediate investigation. The absence of resolution after 20 years suggests that whatever happened to Brian on that early morning in April 2006 was either extraordinarily well concealed or occurred in a way that left no recoverable evidence. The question of what happened to Brian Shaffer continues to haunt those who remember him and those who have become familiar with his case through media coverage. His disappearance represents not just an individual tragedy, but a reminder of human vulnerability, of how quickly a normal evening can become a family's worst nightmare, and of the limitations of even the most thorough investigations when confronted with a complete absence of evidence. Brian walked into the Ugly Tuna Saloona as a young man with a bright future, and he vanished as if he had never existed at all, leaving behind only questions that may never be answered and a family that continues to hope for closure that may never come.